Since 1934, Iowa's farmers have turned to the Iowa Farm Bureau spokesman as their trusted news source. Now, the Spokesman Speaks. Listen in and hear from leading experts on topics important to farmers and agriculture. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our May 20th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today you'll hear some new facts about agriculture and greenhouse gas emissions that will directly challenge some of the claims and accusations that you've seen online or in the news. We'll also update you on where things currently stand with the Farm Bill. Both the House and Senate recently released plans for a new Farm Bill, with the House planning to mark up its version of the Farm Bill later this week. Iowa Farm Bureau National Policy Advisor Daniel Heady has been following the Farm Bill discussions very closely. He recently returned from a trip to Washington, D.C. and shared an update with Spokesman editor Tom Block.
Daniel, it's been quiet on the Farm Bill discussion since Congress passed the one-year extension last year, but there's been some activity recently. Update us on the status and what's been going on with the Farm Bill talks out in Washington.
Yeah, sure. It kind of been radio silence since last September, when the Farm Bill initially expired. We got the extension late last year. That brings us all the way through September of this year. So we have a Farm Bill in law, but it needs to be reauthorized. So we're looking for a 5-year Farm Bill. Like I said, it's been pretty quiet. A couple weeks ago, we got 2 Farm Bills in one day. So we've had nothing happening for 5-6 months. So we got 2 Farm Bills in one day. Chairman Thompson on the House side put out his Farm Bill. Not actual text, but we got a 5-page kind of explainer about what their vision for the Farm Bill is. And then Senator Stabenow put out a 94-page explainer, section by section. And so we've had lots of work to do to digest all that information, and it's a lot of work after a lot of waiting.
Yeah, 94 pages just on the explainers is quite a bunch to chew through, much less when we get to the actual bill. You've been through these documents that both sides have released. What are some of the differences in the overviews released by the leaders of the House and Senate? Some things that would support Farm Bill policy and any concerns we might have?
Yeah, so I'll start on the House side. Chairman Thompson's bill, and again, we don't know exactly the devils in the details of a lot of these things. We only got a 5-page explainer, but it encompasses a lot of the things we want to see. Higher reference prices on ARC and PLC, conservation program oversight, like looking at CRP, strengthening that cap on county rental rates, a Prop 12 fix, something to stop California from regulating how folks operate outside of their state, and a few other smaller priorities, increases in MAP and F&D, foreign ag promotion programs, those sorts of things. When you move over to the Senate side, Senator Stabenow, her proposal, they're not far apart if you just look at the sheer number of things, right? Higher reference prices on her side, increased crop insurance premium support, a lot of small and young and beginning farmer program updates, those sorts of things. She doesn't include a Prop 12 fix. There's some climate and environmental regulations on there that we really don't enjoy. But, Senator Stabenow has said this is a starting point for her, and it encompasses a lot of the things from her side of the aisle, a couple things from, the Republican side of the aisle as well. So, as far as substance goes, there's a lot of the similarities between the two bills, but, Farm bills are done haggling over that 10% that may be different.
The good news, I guess, is nothing was met with dead on arrival status, so maybe there is some bipartisanship and willingness to at least talk things out here to start. What does the timeline look like? What are the next steps on each side? And knowing that this is an election year, do you expect that to come into play at all?
Yeah, certainly. So timeline-wise, Chairman Thompson has announced that he's going to mark his bill up on the 23rd of May. So we will have a committee hearing on the bill and a committee vote on the bill. They don't expect that to be a 2-day markup. I think they view it as something that's going to happen fairly, not quickly, but, regular process, not something that's overly filled with drama. At least we hope so. Then again, this is Congress and they love the drama out there. So we should get the actual text of that bill, a week prior. So hoping for something around the 16th, but again, we'll see. So as far as next steps for them, that's really what the House Ag Committee is looking for. The chairman has said that he believes that this will be a bipartisan vote. I've not heard a single Democrat say, yes, we are voting for the bill. We also don't have text. So it's sort of a wait and see kind of moment. And what happens in that committee vote will really tell what happens on the floor. If it is bipartisan and it's a big bipartisan vote, then you'll probably see the bill move fairly quickly. If it is partisan, probably looking at next steps. On the Senate side, Senator Stabenow has said the draft that she released is not going to be so that she's bringing to the committee. But she wanted to make sure that starting point was out there for everyone to look at and view as we move forward. So the Senate seems to be moving a little slower than the House side, but at least we have movement, we have progress. This is a good thing that we have two bills, because at least we have a starting point. We know where everyone stands. Biggest question in the last couple of months is where is everybody, right? Where's everyone stand? So the fact that we have, hard marks on where everyone's at, we believe is really good progress. And to the latter part of your question, it is an election year. It's a presidential election year. That will definitely play a factor. Congress is only in a total of 6 weeks between the 4th of July and Election Day. And so that means at most probably 30 days of floor time, probably closer to 20. So as far as floor time goes, we're really looking at a minimal floor time available come July. So that may slow some things down. There's always a lame duck. But again, Washington is a place of miracles sometimes. So we'll just have to see what happens.
As Daniel mentioned, we're expecting to see some action on the House's Farm Bill proposal later this week, so stay tuned. Now, let's turn to the topic I mentioned at the top of the show, agriculture and greenhouse gas emissions. By now, we're all pretty familiar with some of the accusations that have been hurled at agriculture, especially livestock farming, when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. But there's another side of the story that doesn't get reported very often. American Farm Bureau economist Danny Munch recently published some in-depth analysis of agriculture and greenhouse gases using newly released data from the EPA. And, despite the claims by agriculture's opponents, Danny found that agriculture is actually significantly reducing its emissions with every new pound of meat and gallon of milk produced. For more, here's economist Danny Munch with spokesman reporter Bob Beyond.
So in recent years, there's been a growing amount of news coverage, online discourse, or noise about the topic of agriculture and greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, that means there's a lot of misinformation out there as well. So you recently published an article about U.S. agriculture's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. What are a couple of the most interesting things that you discovered?
Yeah, and just for a little bit of background on that report, the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, releases that annual report. It's called the Inventory of U.S. Greenhouse Gas Emissions and Sinks. And that tracks all U.S. greenhouse gas emissions from man-made sectors going back to 1990. It also includes any carbon dioxide captured from a sink, so things like uptake of CO2 through soils and land use. And overall, when we look at that data, it's important to note, too, that there's a 2-year delay. So all the data I'll be talking about today will be 2022 data. We saw a 1.3% increase between 2021 and 2022, but agriculture dropped 1.8%. So that's really the story that I'll be able to talk about today. And that's the largest decrease of any economic sector and the lowest ag emissions in 10 years. And just looking broadly at that aggregate increase in emissions, part of the conversation there is we still had a rebound of the economy after COVID, 2022. People were still changing their purchasing decisions. People were starting to go back to school, people opening restaurants and so forth. So part of that increase that we've seen overall, that's not reflected in agriculture, which still had to produce food, regardless of whether or not COVID was an issue, was that return of the economy there.
So why did you feel this was an important topic to broach?
Yeah, American Farm Bureau, we're representing farmers and ranchers, right? We're trying to tell the story of farmers and ranchers being the stewards of their land. They rely on their land to make ends meet each year, and being able to grow each and every year moving forward allows them to have stability in their income as well as their communities. So having these numbers, diving into these numbers really provides that perspective on how agriculture ranks in terms of man-made emissions, which are often exaggerated by a lot of, media opportunities, some public officials, things like that. And each and every year, EPA releases those numbers and really reaffirms that agriculture makes up a very small portion of total emissions. And the emissions it does release are supporting an industry that the nation relies upon 3 times a day, 365 days a year. So it's really important to utilize these numbers to tell our story and really show that, folks got to eat. And the emissions from what folks are eating are, in perspective, quite small compared to other industries out there.
Yeah, so what are the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. economy, and where does agriculture factor into that?
Yeah, so when we measure greenhouse gas emissions, we use million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. So it could be another gas we're talking about, maybe methane, but this is standardizing the quantity into a CO2 equivalent. So that's just some background there. The largest emission source was the transportation sector. They represented over a quarter of all emissions, 28%, and that totaled 1.8 billion metric tons. Transportation emissions declined 0.2%, or 4 million metric tons between 2021 and 2022. Following transportation, you add electricity generation, so coal production, any of your other sort of energy production, that represented a quarter of total emissions in the United States at 1.57 billion metric tons. And those emissions declined 0.4% between 2021 and 2022. The industrial sector, that includes production of iron and steel and other input materials, that came in at number 3 and represented 23% of all emissions, 1.45 billion metric tons. You also have a section that includes commercial and residential sectors, home, cooking, heating, cooling, and U.S. territories, so any of the emissions from Guam, Puerto Rico, things like that. And that represented 14% of U.S. emissions and increased 4.8%, so the largest increase. Meanwhile, agriculture, we represented just under 10% of U.S. emissions, 634 million metric tons, and that was a 2% or 12 million metric ton decline from 2021, the largest decrease seen by any sector.
Is there a percentage of U.S. emissions that comes from livestock?
They have data that allows us to drill a little bit further down into, what's coming from crop cultivation, what's coming from livestock, and what's coming from fuel use in the ag sector. Livestock is just around 4.32%, 274 million metric tons of the total, and that's down 2.1% from 2020. And part of that decline is likely linked to smaller livestock inventories, particularly in beef cattle. We had a significant amount of drought in 2022, which were liquidated at higher rates because of those drought conditions. So a smaller beef herd does lend itself to a slightly fewer greenhouse gas emissions, but you also have to factor in the technological advancements as well. Crop cultivation made just over 5% of all emissions, 319 million metric tons. Reasoning could be linked to fertilizer application dynamics because prices were high that year, but also the productivity gains through technology adoption, better input use, things like that.
Yeah, these numbers are extremely interesting. Agriculture, especially livestock, often gets blamed for U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, even though ag is a relatively small contributor to those emissions. Why do you think that is?
I find the discussion a bit ironic sometimes because I think a lot of consumers, investors, public officials, they use livestock as sort of a scapegoat for explaining human-made emissions because people aren't really making livestock management decisions in their everyday lives. It seems kind of distant to a lot of consumers. Unlike the decision to drive a car or buy a flight on a plane or turn on your AC, those decisions they're much more accessible to consumers, but folks aren't really talking about them in sort of this conversation as much. And producing food at that scale, to feed over 333 million Americans and millions of folks abroad, it takes land and involves natural biological processes that release emissions, right? So when we think about deer, bison, antelope, giraffes, cattle, they're all ruminants that eructate methane in the process of rumination. Humans didn't design cattle to do that. That's how their digestive system works. Humans did, however, design planes, trains, automobiles, and any of the industrial manufacturing processes to produce energy. So when the conversation is about that biological process that happens in nature, it's just interesting compared to a process that humans control the design of in producing energy. So, folks like to really make asks of the supply chain that they might not have a lot of input on. But in the case of agriculture, it often leads to, excess regulation, consolidation. So making sure that we're really looking at all the decisions that folks are making in their everyday and which ones are linked to biology versus which ones can actually be changed and improved more drastically, that's important as well.
Yeah, the numbers from your economics team are pretty telling, showing that greenhouse gas emissions from livestock in particular actually are falling pretty significantly, like you mentioned, when you factor in the increases in production. A couple examples: emissions per gallon of milk are down 26% since 1990. Emissions per pound of beef are down 17%, and emissions per pound of pork are down 23%. So What can you tell us about that? And what does it say about the trajectory of U.S. agriculture's sustainability, especially the sustainability of livestock?
Yeah, and this is an important piece of the conversation. If you zoom out and look over time, you will see, yes, overall ag emissions have increased by about 6 to 7% since 1990. But we have to remember we've added 83 million people to our population that time frame. The world has added billions of people. Each new person means more food, more energy to support, more infrastructure in our cities and community support. So we have to factor those in when we look at emissions numbers. And when you do that, it shows really a much different story, as you mentioned in those numbers. Per unit milk produced since 1990 has increased by over 50%, but emissions have dropped per unit per gallon 26%. Red meat, we've increased production by over 46%, and emissions per pound have dropped 23%, for instance, for pork. And a lot of that is linked to advancements in animal nutrition, breeding, husbandry, better husbandry management techniques, technological adoption that limits waste. So the ag industry really is taking this issue head on, becoming more sustainability. And why are they doing that? Because it's important for the economic sustainability as well. To be able to compete in sort of this globalized economy we're now in, using less inputs and less energy to produce more is really in the wheelhouse and incentivized for farmers. So it kind of loops into the whole sustainability story of reducing inputs, reducing emissions, and American farmers and ranchers have been able to do that.
There's another number that kind of stood out from your economics team showing that when you factor in total factor productivity, U.S. agriculture's overall emissions is down 25% since 1990. I heard someone say that means U.S. agriculture has cut its emissions per unit of food, fiber, and energy produced by 25%. Could you maybe expand on that a little bit?
Sure. USDA, they have this metric that they use called total factor productivity. And one way to think about this is that the U.S. and any other country is inherently constrained in some ways in terms of inputs. Land is probably the easiest input to talk about. Agriculture in the U.S., in most states, uses about the same amount of land each year, often fewer acres. Since 1950, farmers are using 323 million fewer acres. That's about double the size of Texas. We're using less in land each year, but production has increased. And that's really what total factor productivity represents. What increases in production are linked to productivity gains because of technological advancements, as inputs use remain the same or often decline. So since 1948, farmers and ranchers are producing nearly 3 times as much output per unit of input. And we sort of factor in those emissions, adjust for some of your population increases. That means we have about a 25% decline in ag emissions when we adjust for total factor productivity since 1990. So that's where that stat comes from.
So other sectors of the U.S. economy you kind of touched on a little bit earlier, but are they making any kind of impressive progress like ag, or is ag leading the way?
I think, there are technological advancements kind of occurring in every industry that lend themselves to fewer emissions. And part of this is just because we have an investor environment, much of the public, government officials that are all working towards and have a view of limiting emissions. But I really think this kind of shows agriculture's leadership even more, because as those advancements occur in all these sectors, the pie of total emissions sort of shrinks. So you have a smaller pie, which means each year it's harder and harder to maintain a smaller piece of the pie. So the fact that the ag sector is continuously able to decline really shows, one, the volatility in agriculture. Part of these are linked to biological processes, populations of animals, the acres operated, but also that innovation, whether it be genetics, chemical use, irrigation, have really shown positive results in a manner that competes with these other industries. And that's really helped out for our farmers with economic stability while still being able to reduce emissions as well.
So clearly U.S. ag has made a lot of progress. How does that stack up to agriculture around the world?
Yeah, so in their inventory report that EPA does, they don't really go into a lot of other countries, but I was able to find some data in some research. In terms of agriculture by itself, U.S. is the most efficient nation overall. I mean, there are some European countries, New Zealand, that come close, but a lot of developing countries, not even close in terms of per unit emissions per, pound of insert whatever agricultural product here. But when looking at overall emissions, the U.S. is doing better as well. Between 2019 and 2021, for instance, U.S. emissions have declined by 7%. By comparison, Chinese emissions have increased 6%. Emissions from India have increased over 3%, Russia almost 4%, Brazil up over 5%, and Indonesia up at 7%. And many of these countries, they're developing nations, they have fast-growing populations, and their public officials, markets really have less concern for environmental regulation or emissions wholly. So any of the conversations we're having about emissions have to include these nations that, when you combine India's population, Russia, China, Indonesia, Brazil, they eclipse our population by many times over. So those conversations really have to include discussions of those nations too.
What will it take for U.S. agriculture to continue making progress in reducing emissions and in overall sustainability?
I think those opportunities are quite endless. Producing more with less is how businesses compete in the global economy, like I sort of mentioned before. And we have to really foster an environment where businesses are incentivized to make investments that improve their margin and can reduce energy and input use along the way. Any excess regulations that make U.S. farmers, which are the most green farmers out there, unable to compete with farmers in nations where environmental concerns are not really priorities, will really counter any beneficial movements towards greener world economy that we have. And, any robust farm bill programs that support those voluntary conservation practices and efforts are also extremely important to supporting our farmers as well.
And how about the positive impact of ethanol and biodiesel? Iowa ranks number one nationally in ethanol and biodiesel production. And in 2022, the use of both reduced greenhouse gas emissions by an amount equivalent to taking 30 million cars off the road.
Ethanol, renewable fuels are part of this story. And when we talk about ethanol, production has increased from about 4 billion gallons back in 2005, and we're up close to 16 billion gallons in 2023. That's renewable fuel from plants replacing gasoline. You also have the growth in renewable diesels and biodiesel. Renewable diesel, for instance, is a drop-in fuel, so that can replace petroleum-based diesel 100%, meaning heavy machinery like semi-trucks can completely run on that fuel made from soy oils and other oilseeds products. And production of those products combined has increased from 91 million gallons back in 2005 to 1.4 billion gallons in 2015. And now we're up over 4 billion gallons currently. So producing a lot more renewable fuels that will continue to reduce petroleum-based emissions in our cars.
So clearly there's a very positive story here about the sustainability of U.S. agriculture. How can we all help the public and key stakeholders understand the progress that's being made?
I really think all of these statistics show that when agriculture, when farmers and ranchers are recognized as partners towards sustainability, we can have these sort of achievements and emissions reductions. I also always tell, one of the things I always tell farmers is if you don't tell your story, somebody else will tell it for you. So we really have to make sure that we continue from the grassroots level to tell our stories to the public, make sure we're connecting with people in urban areas that are disconnected from how their food is produced. They're the ones thinking that, beef cattle producers can eliminate the vast majority of their emissions, when if you really understood production processes, you'd know that a lot of that's linked to biology and other things. Continuing to support our farmers through these farm bill discussions to make sure that those voluntary market-based incentives are there to reduce ag's environmental footprint while still being able to support rural communities and make ends meet on the farm. So telling our story and making sure we're advocating in a way that resonates with consumers who all utilize our food each and every day.
Thanks, Danny. We know that farm innovation, efficiency, and technology produce environmental benefits, and it's always good to see reports that help quantify some of agriculture's sustainability gains. If you'd like to learn more from Danny, we've linked his article on agriculture and greenhouse gases down in the notes for this podcast episode. We've also linked to Iowa Farm Bureau's Farm Facts page, which summarizes some of Danny's impressive findings and captures even more of agriculture's environmental progress. Well, we've reached the end of this podcast episode, but just one more thing before you go. This summer, Iowa Farm Bureau is hosting a 2-day educational tour of innovative ag sites in western Iowa and Nebraska. The 2024 Young Farmer Ag Insights Tour is July 11th through 12th, and it will include stops at Lonely Oak Distillery, Elite Octane, Lincoln Premium Poultry, and more. If you're a young farmer or ag professional who would like the opportunity to learn while networking with your peers from across the state, be sure to sign up for the tour using the link down in the notes for this podcast episode. That's all for this edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us for the next one on June 3rd. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.